The Dragon Ball timeline is one of various events and stories, but there isn't just one. Many times in the anime, there are timelines separate from the main story. Even the main story itself is a variation of the original timeline. Today, we're going to discuss all variations of the very confusing timeline in Dragon Ball. The original Dragon Ball timeline starts with Zeno creating all the universes, and all major Dragon Ball events take place, as you know, all the way up until the Android Saga, which is where the first timeline split takes place, right? Wrong. The first timeline split is one which I'm willing to bet 90% of fans are unaware of. The first split took place billions of years ago in Universe 12. A mortal scientist created a time machine and actually used it. We know that when a person uses anything other than a time ring, traveling back and forth in time creates a split in the timeline. So whoever this scientist was created a timeline split. The Supreme Kai of Universe 12 took the time machine from this person and supposedly resolved whatever problems took place there. This was the time machine that Goku Black and Zamasu were in possession of during their undertaking of the Zero Mortal plan. Now we're gonna jump all the way to the Android Saga, and I know that's a big jump, but we're not discussing every event that takes place in the timeline, but rather every timeline that's formed, and how they came to be. In the original timeline, Goku uses instant transmission to come to Earth and kill both King Cold and Frieza before dying of a heart virus, following which Androids 17 and 18 attack. The androids lay waste to the Z Fighters, killing all of them with the exception of a young Gohan. Bulma is pregnant at this time and gives birth to Trunks, who Gohan trains to one day become a Super Saiyan and help him take down the androids. Gohan, Trunks, and Bulma are the last light of this timeline, that is until Gohan dies fighting them, causing Trunks to become a Super Saiyan. Unfortunately, even with this development, he isn't enough to take them down, which leads to Bulma continuing work on a time machine, which she had been planning on for a long time. Once built, future Trunks uses it to go back in time 3 years before the androids attack. Trunks alters the course of the original timeline by killing Mecha Frieza and King Cold himself, whereas in the original timeline, Goku did it. Goku arrives slightly later as he doesn't feel the need to use instant transmission, and Trunks leaves knowledge of the android's attack as well as the heart virus destined to kill Goku, along with the medicine to save him. He bids farewell to them, and 3 years of training commences between the group. So now we've established two timelines, one where Trunks came from, and now the one that Trunks has created, which is the main timeline, and will have significant changes going forward. This Trunks goes back to his timeline and naturally realizes that nothing has changed. This is because his expectation of the timeline changes was that him saving Goku's life should alter his future, but instead it created another timeline branch. His timeline exists the same way, whereas the timeline he just altered is the one where Goku is alive. Now, this is where it gets kind of confusing. When a timeline branch is created, the rules of time travel in Dragon Ball dictate that at the time that branch was made, linked both timelines, so that time passes equally in both. For example, the main timeline doesn't have to wait 20 or so years to catch up to the future timeline. The point at which the time travel happened is the point that they're synchronized at. Why is this relevant, you might be wondering? Well, upon returning from the main timeline, future Trunks doesn't exactly wait 3 entire years to time travel once more and find out what happened after the androids attack. He just slaps in coordinates to travel 3 years into the future. But he can't exactly do that. Him traveling 3 years into the future of another timeline isn't possible if he's doing the traveling from the future timeline. For him to get 3 years into the future of the main timeline, he would have to travel in the main timeline. Luckily, just so the whole world of Dragon Ball time travel isn't blown up there just so happens to be a retcon that takes place 20-some real-life years later in Dragon Ball Super. While doing work on the time machine, Pilaf notes that changing frequencies in the transporter can allow them to jump into parallel worlds. So hypothetically speaking, Trunks could have jumped into a later point in the parallel timeline. It's still confusing, but we'll ignore that. However, what this means is that there's now yet another timeline branch, one where Trunks warns them, and now Trunks re-entering into another point in time of the timeline where he warns them, which would create another branch because it would be different without him intervening. So Trunks jumps into the point where he sees Android 19 and Jiro, who he doesn't recognize, by the way, a major difference caused as a result of the timeline alteration. Jiro escapes, eventually leading to the activation of Androids 17 and 18, who turn out to be much stronger than the androids in the future. But not only that, there's now a third android who is far stronger than even them. The Z Fighters proceed to get laid out. The next timeline is the one where Cell comes from. Future Trunks, Gohan, and Bulma locate a separate time machine and find a cocoon next to it. What came from the cocoon? Cell. How did Cell get his hands on a time machine? Trunks. There is yet another timeline to be introduced here, but as it turns out, this is the very original timeline where Trunks traveled to the past and with the Z Fighters figured out how to stop the androids, but after he returned to the future, Imperfect Cell killed him, took his time machine, and traveled to the main timeline where he now absorbs Androids 17 and 18 to become perfect. As I was writing this, many of you may be in disbelief or confused.
You're goddamn right.
If this cell is from the original timeline and he kills Trunks to get to the main timeline, where did this Trunks come from? Well, this Trunks is from the History of Trunks special. There are two versions of future Trunks between these timelines. One version comes back, warns the Z Fighters, and alongside Trunks they defeat the androids before Cell. This Trunks doesn't train in the hyperbolic time chamber with Vegeta, so when he returns to the future and somehow defeats the androids, we don't exactly know how, but it was likely not with his power and rather with a device similar to the one Krillin refused to use on 18. Anyways, Imperfect Cell later kills that Trunks when he's about to travel back to the past and instead travels a year further back, which creates another timeline branch. Within this timeline branch, the future Trunks from the Trunks special would arrive, and he went through everything we discussed earlier, but in the main timeline they don't stop the androids. They train in the hyperbolic time chamber, and that later leads to Gohan going Super Saiyan 2 and killing the Cell that traveled back in time after killing the original timeline Trunks. After which the Trunks that did go through the training leaves the main timeline and goes back to his future. Already knowing of Cell and how he took his time machine in the other timeline, this Trunks is prepared for him, and he proceeds to put an end to him in the future timeline. Now to recap, so far there's the Universe 12 timeline variation, the original timeline variation, the future timeline variation, the first main timeline variation where Cell travels to 4 years before the androids, the second one where Trunks warned them, and the third variation where Trunks comes back after the 3-year time jump. So far we have 6 variations of the timeline, but of course there's more. The more doesn't show its ugly face until Dragon Ball Super, where the only arc that really matters in relation to the video topic is the Goku Black arc, / the second Future Trunks arc, / the Zamasu arc.
Bruh.
Anyways, while there's 6 variations to the timeline, the only ones that are in discussion is the timeline that this Trunks traveled back to, and the main timeline. The main timeline has been through the Buu arc as you know it, Battle of Gods as you know it, Resurrection of Frieza as you know it, and the Universe 6 tournament. On the other hand, Future Trunks' timeline has had some really weird developments. Because the android apocalypse lasted 20 some years, at least that's the speculation, Babidi took his time to come to Earth. Supposedly he was gathering energy to revive Buu. Luckily, Shin and Kibito got Trunks, who for some reason has blue hair now, and trained him with the Z-Sword to prepare for Babidi and Deborah. Trunks fights Deborah, and even with Super Saiyan 2 as well as some Z-Sword training, he isn't able to stop him until casualties have already happened. In this battle, Shin and Kibito both die, but they manage to prevent Buu from coming out altogether. Now, because Shin dies here, Beerus is dead. In this 20+ year apocalypse, it's unclear if Beerus ever woke up, but the speculation is if he still had his dream, and if he still woke up to fight a Super Saiyan god, he wouldn't come to Earth because Earth would have been an apocalyptic and destroyed world, with only a half Saiyan still alive. But on the other hand, there's Vampa, which would have been a much better option because Broly is a beast and would have offered Beerus a good fight. So Beerus either doesn't wake up and just died when Shin died, or he did and simply fought Broly. Regardless, Trunks' life didn't get any better as the new foe Goku Black shows up, and this is where we get into the timeline mess. When we see Universe 10 Supreme Kai, Kawasu, and his apprentice Zamasu, who is just a past version of Goku Black in a different timeline, were presented with the time rings. The silver time rings are a way for Supreme Kai to travel back and forth in time without creating any timeline branches, and these green ones represent different timelines. At the start, there are only 4 rings here, and it's pretty clear that that doesn't add up, so the series does disobey its own logic here. Given that Goku Black was using a silver time ring, he doesn't create a timeline branch by entering into future Trunks' timeline. But how did Goku Black become Goku Black? Well, it's a future version of the main timeline Zamasu, using the Super Dragon Balls to trade places with the main timeline Goku. So if Trunks didn't travel back in time in this arc, the main timeline would take course as it does, and Goku would die. I swear to God, every time Trunks and Goku are in the same sentence, Trunks is somehow saving him from a story set on killing him repeatedly. So luckily, Trunks does travel through time again to the main timeline, causing a timeline branch. The original main timeline in this case leads to Goku Black being born, and the new timeline 7 leads to Trunks informing the Z Fighters of Black. Black then shows up, but it's through the time ring, so it doesn't create a branch yet again, and then we meet Zamasu. This Zamasu in timeline 6 would go on to become Black, but because of Trunks' intervention, Goku, Beerus, and Whis go to see him, which leads to him going insane quicker as a result of fighting Goku and realizing just how strong mortals are. God damn it, Trunks. Anyways, that storyline eventually leads to Zamasu getting erased from existence in the main timeline. For whatever reason, even though he's a god and should know more about time than he does, Beerus assumes that him killing Zamasu in this timeline would make him vanish in the other timeline. Surprise, surprise, it doesn't.
Bruh.
In the future timeline, the Z Fighters are now facing Goku Black and Zamasu. Where did this Zamasu come from? Well, Goku Black Zamasu came to future Trunks' timeline and sped up the process of this timeline Zamasu going mad by killing his master and making him turn to the Darkseid with the Zero Mortal plan. Moving on. The next important event is when Zeno erases future Trunks' timeline. The group manages to escape, and for some reason on God's green earth, I swear to God I have no clue how this makes any sense, but Beerus killing Zamasu according to Whis created another goddamn timeline. How? How does that make any sense? There was no timeline branch, there was no time travel, how could that possibly have resulted in another timeline? Anyways, me yelling at logic not making sense isn't gonna do anything, but according to the angel here, that's what happened. For some reason, he decides to suggest an idea that's much more stupid than it sounds when you think about. As we know, Whis tells Trunks and Mai that he can send them to their timeline sometime before Zeno destroyed it. Only issue is there would be 2 Trunkses and 2 Mais, and Black and Zamasu would still be there. And you know what, I take it back, it sounds stupid, not just when you think about it, but when you hear it too. Of course, that would make another timeline branch, and that's not all. Whis also explains that to deal with Black and Zamasu, he's going to confer with Beerus of this new timeline before he dies. But again, won't that also create another timeline branch? I'm losing track here, guys. In all, these last few minutes of the Goku Black arc shows complete and utter stupidity from a being who's supposed to be aware of the ins and outs of all this, given that he's a goddamn angel. So I'm 80% sure that there's actually 10 timelines in Dragon Ball. Thank you guys so much for watching, like and subscribe, and check out this video to continue your good day on YouTube.